This is a very top-end overview of some of the work that we've been doing here in the different products. So the project started just last year in 2020. Because of the multiple locations that we have, we've been able to collect 5 site years of CBD data, 6 site years of grain data. And this year was the first time actually that we had a dedicated fiber trial. In 2019 and 2020, we just collected fiber data from primarily grain cultivars. But Phil was able to connect us with some folks in the Czech Republic called Hemp Point.
Let's talk about the power of hemp, from the farm field to finished goods. Learn all about it at the 2022 Midwest iHemp Expo, May 20th through 21st at the Lansing Center. Visit MidwestIHempExpo.com. See you there. We are live on the iHemp Hour. My name is Dave Craybill. I'm with iHemp Michigan. iHemp Michigan's Michigan. I can't talk.
You can do it. Say it 3 times fast, So.
Yeah, practice makes perfect, right? So our mission is to educate, inform, and promote the research, development, and cultivation of industrial hemp here in Michigan. And it generally begins with the farmer, but we're going to start with Mike Brennan to talk about some 420 Post news.
Definitely not a farmer here, but from the other side of the 0.3 dividing line, shall we say? This one's for you, Dave. Darren McCarty is now partnered with PinCana to launch a whole line of edibles, and it's all sorts of fun stuff in there. Gummies, tinctures. He's got all sorts of crazy sorts of names that he's named them. Darren's a recovering alcoholic, and one of the things cannabis did for him was really helped him get past that. So he doesn't drink anymore, but he's now in the cannabis industry, and it's really helped him a lot. And like I say, he's done a whole line of he has a whole line of smokable cannabis products, and now he has a whole line of gummies. And if you want to find out all the details, you can find that at mimarijuanareport.com. The other thing a couple other things I wanted to mention yesterday on my show, this would be a fun one. Cincy Magazine is going to be having a Mardi Gras party on March 1st in Lansing, and trying to get the cannabis community together for a Mardi Gras party. So, and so that'll be at a convention center there in Lansing, lots of room. I know lots of people are hoping, we don't know yet because of the COVID, whether that's going to go off, but it's March 1st. We're still 2 months away, and keep our fingers crossed, right? So anybody that really wants to get plugged into, quite literally, the cannabis players in the state, check that out again at mitechnews.com. Jamie Cooper was on my show yesterday. There's a video up on Facebook that people can watch, very short, about 3 minutes, and she explains what's going on, tickets, sponsorships, booths, whatnot. We're a media sponsor, so we're going to have a table there, and definitely going to get a room for that night because we're going to have a suite, so we'll be entertaining people. The last thing that pricked up my attention is MJ Biz, which is one of the major cannabis publications nationally, was just acquired by a group called Emerald X for $120 million. There's hope for us at MI Marijuana Report, right? And then there's some potential considerations and earnouts that come with that. So 120 million in cash, and then points or something thereafter. They didn't get into real specifics on that, but that's a tidy. Considering they've only been in business for 4 or 5 years, that's making a lot of people happy. They're based out of the Denver area, and I think it's one of those deals where the principals stick around for a year or two and train everybody, and then step out and take their money and run. Something I hope to do someday. So absolutely. All right. So back to you, Dave.
All right. Just a little bit of news. You want me to share my news first, Blaine?
Yeah.
So a couple of things shared with me. There's a request for rulemaking. The Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Marijuana Regulatory Agency is setting up industrial hemp rules for marijuana businesses, and it involves total THC in products. So the intent is, what's happening is, even though it's 0.3% of the entire, perhaps an edible, it's only 0.3%, but it might be over that 4 milligram or 5 milligram THC level, whatever, and they're going to come up with that level. Normally, if you buy an edible from one of Mike Brennan's businesses, it's going to be like a 10 milligram of THC, and that's going to be intoxicating, right? So,
well, it can go up to 25 in some cases, but yeah, go ahead. So,
oh, that's crazy. Okay, so so the idea is, it's not just the 0.3%, but it's also going to be a limit on the amount of THC that can be sold and still qualify as industrial hemp. So they're going through that thought process. So yeah, heads up on that. That's coming your way. Some good news, because like, Lord knows we don't need more regulation, but anyways, we do need some regulation. But on some good news, anyhow, there's observed impact of long-term consumption of oral cannabidiol on liver function in healthy adults. So this study was released, and they're saying that it doesn't hurt your liver. We've done this. It wasn't a double-blind study because it was done before. The study started before everything was fully legalized, and they couldn't do everything that they needed to do, which is kind of funny, the nature of that whole conundrum. But we want knowledge and information. So I think I'll look forward to more studies in the future, but this is showing that there's no effect on the liver, or nominal. So that's available. I've posted on our LinkedIn iHemp Michigan page, and on Facebook, I believe. I'll try and get it posted to the website as well. So that's all the news I had to share today.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave. That's really good news to be hearing about. So absolutely. So I don't have really too much news to share this week, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Expo. And Mike, thanks for sharing that. I did not see your show yesterday, but I'll go back and look at that. And I think iHemp Michigan may need to attend that as a sponsor, since we're looking at them to be part of the Expo that we're going to have. So
yeah, Jamie says she's expecting about 100 sponsors. I think it's in a convention center. So, I mean, I think we're going to have a lot of folks there. Again, depending on the COVID situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would highly encourage that. You could really get plugged into the cannabis community.
Yeah, well, eventually we'll be walking hand in hand, probably eventually with at some point. But so thanks, Mike, for sharing that very much. But I do want to talk about the Expo that we had planned for this month. It was going to be January 21st and 22nd. And due to a lot of things, one was the COVID concern that we had at that time, which has certainly played out to be very true. We decided to move this to May. So it's still May 21st, 22nd. Going to be at the Lansing Center, at the Expo there. We have a deal with the Radisson Hotel for rooms. And we're also going to do the Hemp Awards on Friday night. So it's all still going to go on like we were going to do in January. We've just moved it out to May. And we're looking forward to having a great Expo. We're going to be able to do different things that we're going to do in January a little bit. We're going to have a lot of the building industry and what's going on there. So we're really looking forward to a good Expo in May. So stay tuned. More on that. We'll be talking more on that real soon. So so that's kind of what we got going on right now. So, but we have a great show today. We knew that everybody, one of the things we wanted to make sure we covered in January at the Expo, of course, was going to be the varieties and the trials that have happened on those, so everybody can figure out, what varieties they want to plant and what varieties will produce what they're trying to do, either whether it be flower or whether it be fiber or grain. And this last year, through a collaborative effort with MSU Extension and Illinois Extension and a couple of labs and a bunch of growers that got a reduction on their price for that, we were able to gather a lot more information. And then also there was also some trials that they did. So that's why we have James DeDecker on us from MSU Extension and Phillip Alberti from the Illinois Extension. Pleasure meeting both you guys before in the past, and we appreciate all the effort you guys are putting into this and what you're able to share with us, because this is the building block that we need to know. we need to know what varieties are going to do here, what varieties are going to go hot, what varieties are going to produce, whether it be flower, whether it be grain or fiber, what's going to do the best in the different areas that we have around here. So guys, I really appreciate you having time tonight to come on and be able to talk with us. And I'm not sure if you guys did rock, paper, scissors on who's going first, but we'll let you guys figure out how you're going. So thanks for being on tonight, guys.
Thank you, Blaine. I think I'll take the mic first here. So really appreciate the opportunity to join the iHemp Hour again. As Blaine said, I'm James DeDecker with Michigan State University, and we've been involved with hemp research since 2019 at Michigan State, and we're continuing those trials. I have a few slides to share, Blaine, if that's okay.
Yeah, you can share.
I'll share my screen.
Yep.
Okay.
You'll also have to tell us about your background there, because I'm pretty mesmerized by all that back there. So.
Oh, so my background is actually a commercial hemp grain field from a farmer in the Upper Peninsula, or a couple, I should say, that were growing. And that was a 2020 photo. They had a really great field, two different varieties on either side of the aisle there. And I think they're all, they're both IHG varieties, I believe. So Blaine, I think you know who I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say their name because I don't have permission, I don't think, but.
Okay. Yeah, we're still waiting for them to come out with their energy bar.
Yes, yeah, they're doing some great things on the processing side in terms of food utilization, and it's exciting to see what's going on there. So I'll start this evening with this title slide, and this is really just to point out the collaboration that we have among some of the land grant institutions in the Midwest here, and also one nonprofit organization, Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. This has been a great team of researchers, extension folks, collaborating to really help move the envelope, raise the bar in terms of hemp research, and make sure that we're getting the information out to growers as quickly as we can to try to improve decision making and opportunities in the industry there. So it's been a great team, exciting to continue working with them. And Phil, as you've seen, is here tonight to share some of his experience with part of this project as well. And I'll also give Phil the credit of really bringing us together. He started the database project that was kind of the impetus for all of us to be working together. So it's been a great partnership.
Right.
So in Michigan here, we have a sort of embedded project within the Midwest collaboration, and that is what we call the Hemp Tribal Research Initiative for Michigan. It's a project that's funded by USDA NIFA Tribal Colleges Research Grant. And so our partners are tribal colleges and tribal communities that are interested in agriculture and cannabis in particular. And we're working with them to build research capacity for agriculture at their institutions. And of course, to answer the questions that we all have about hemp and how that might fit into economies and communities, specifically tribal communities, in terms of economic development and just creating business opportunities for these folks. So our partners on this project are Bay Mills Community College and Waishki Bay Farm. You can see them there in the UP on the map there. Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians and Ziba Mijuang Farm in the northern Lower Peninsula. And then today, actually, I am sitting in Mount Pleasant at Saginaw Chippewa Tribal College. We spent the day today bucking CBD hemp from our trial, and got that done just before the talk today. So they've been great partners as well. And then I'm located in the central UP, where you can see the Sparty helmet there in Chatham. We are the Upper Peninsula Research and Extension Center. And so a lot of our work has been focused in northern Michigan and the UP in particular. This hemp trim project has been focused primarily on variety testing for grain, fiber, and CBD. We also are doing a little bit of weed management work and other pest monitoring, and then really trying to connect with folks in these communities to just understand what their needs and interests are and questions are related to hemp. This is a very top-end overview of some of the work that we've been doing here in the different products. So the project started just last year in 2020. Because of the multiple locations that we have, we've been able to collect 5 site years of CBD data, 6 site years of grain data. And this year was the first time actually that we had a dedicated fiber trial. In 2019 and 2020, we just collected fiber data from primarily grain cultivars. But Phil was able to connect us with some folks in the Czech Republic called Hemp, and they're acting as a distributor for European hemp seed companies, and they were able to connect us with some dedicated fiber genetics this year. And it was really neat to see some of the differences there in terms of how that material performed relative to the grain stuff, which in our trials has mostly been sourced from Canada, a little bit from the US, but primarily Canada. I won't spend a lot of time going through the sort of general results here, but you can see in 2020, we were 69% THC compliant, and you can see the range there of 3.25 to 12.69% CBD in those compliant cultivars. And Phil's going to talk about the CBD work in the context of the hemp database. So that's all about I'll say for CBD today. On the grain side, we've had an opportunity to look at 25 different cultivars over the last couple of years, and our yields have varied widely based on location, based on pest management, from as low as 125 pounds per acre up to 1,400 pounds of grain per acre. We've also identified a lot of emerging pests in Michigan through these trials, things like cannabis aphid, European corn borer, corn earworm, white mold, songbird damage in the grain, depredation of the grain. And so it's a great opportunity for us to document those things and understand what effect they have on the crop in terms of performance, yield, and quality, and what that might mean for growers as far as which pests are really going to need to be managed carefully and which ones might be more incidental or less problematic. You can see in the bottom here a couple of pictures, and that's just to give you a sense of kind of the differences between how we're testing CBD versus grain and fiber. And it really mirrors the differences that you see in terms of production systems out there commercially. So transplants, plastic mulch, wide spacing, et cetera, for CBD, and direct seeded, much higher populations and so forth on the grain and fiber side. The main thing that I want to talk about tonight is some of the results from our grain and fiber trials that were conducted in 2021. And this is the first that this data has been shared. So iHemp is one of our best partners, and we're happy to be able to work with you guys to get this information out. And it's hot off the presses. So, so happy to be sharing it today. So just a little bit of background on how we conducted these grain and fiber trials this last year. We had 2 locations for grain and fiber, the Hyde, Michigan location, which is the central UP, and then Brimley in the eastern UP. These are randomized complete block designs with 4 replications. So we have 4 plots of each variety randomized out there in the design. We managed these 2 sites quite differently this year, just to kind of get us a feel of how the crop would respond to these different management practices. And you can kind of think of them as conventional and organic. The Hyde location was managed conventionally as far as synthetic fertilizer, herbicide, et cetera. And the Brimley location was managed organically. So we used feather meal for fertility and hand weeding instead of herbicide. One of the things I'll talk about in the results is the impact of chemical weed control, the herbicides that we used. And we saw pretty variable response to the herbicide from the different varieties that we had out there. So some, looked like a Roundup Ready soybean plant looks like when you spray Roundup on it. Nothing happened to the crop. Other varieties actually were injured quite significantly from the herbicide that we used. And I think as we expand grain and fiber production in Michigan and in the Midwest, understanding opportunities for chemical weed control, which herbicides might be effective, and getting those, of course, then labeled so that growers have the option of chemical weed control is going to be pretty important. Not for everybody and not always necessary, but is important when it's needed. Let's see. One major difference I want to point out in the practices here is that the grain we're planting at 25 plants per square foot. The fiber we're planting at twice as many, 50 plants per square foot. And I want you to keep those numbers in mind. That's the number of pure live seed that we put out there, but that's not the stand that we end up achieving in the field. And stand establishment, turning those seeds into viable plants, has been one of the challenges that we've really had based on seed quality, seed bed preparation, and other things. So we've planted pretty high rates because we don't get nearly that many plants, and we plant a lot more for fiber versus grain. Let's see, the fiber, if you're not aware with fiber production systems, they're harvested much earlier, kind of mid-flower or early flower. So the fiber was harvested on August 16th this year. Grain harvest started shortly thereafter with some of our very early varieties, August 23rd, and continued all the way through October 28th, just based on maturity of those different varieties. So I've got some tables here, and don't worry about, kind of taking in every last cell in these tables. I'll talk through them, but also just realize that this information is going to be published and it will be available to everybody real shortly here. So you can find it on our UPREC website, and you can, read it at home and take your time with it and really digest it, or as you're looking at, seed to buy or whatever you need, this information will be available. So one of the things that we want to understand, well, let me back up. First, let's look at the variety list. So you can see the varieties that we had here. This is the grain set of varieties here. Some of these may be familiar. Some of these may be less familiar. We also have some that have been anonymized here because some of the companies that we work with want to make sure that they have a chance to look at the data before it is published with their name on it. So we got a couple of ones that are anonymized, but those will hopefully be labeled once we get the go ahead from those folks.
Yeah, that Anon B looks pretty good there. That's the clear winner, right?
Yeah, there's some good ones there. Now, so the first column that we're looking at is seeds per pound. So this is actually a measurement of seed size. And the reason I include that here is that we've seen a lot of variation in seed size from very small to quite large. And also what we've seen is that larger seeds are doing a lot better in terms of stand establishment when we're direct seeding the grain and the fiber into the field. So looking for large seeded varieties certainly has been an advantage for us. Now, the seed also has to be, vigorous and have good germ and so forth, but large seed has been important. If you also think about, the seed is what we're yielding, right? So a variety that has a larger seed, you're going to have potentially more, protein, oil, whatever that might be in that larger seed. So that's something to think about as well. These were all planted on the same date. And then here you can see the stands that we achieved. So some were actually fairly thin this year. Remember, we planted 25 plants per square foot. So in general, we're getting about a half stand, or sometimes less than half a stand establishment from what we planted. So that's a pretty important figure. And, some of it is certainly seedbed prep and the fact that we're drilling versus precision planting, et cetera, et cetera. But it's been a challenge for us to get good stands with grain and fiber hemp.
Well, what does that mean? Explain to me. Let's talk at the one at the very top. Stand, yes. 1 foot square, 8. Yep. So you had 8 plants per square foot then?
Yes, exactly. Yep. So let me give you a sense of how we do that. So we drill a plot. The plots are 4 foot by 16 foot. So it's a small area. And then we go out there with a little square of, rebar or PVC or whatever it is. We put that down in the plot 2 or 3 times, and we count the number of plants, and then we report an average of those. Some of our stands drilling with our plot drill also can be somewhat uneven. That's why we have to take more than one in a plot there. So, yep, that's what we're saying there. Now, when we see the yields, you may think, well, actually, those stand numbers weren't so bad. I think 25 plants per square foot, if all the seeds we put in turned into plants, actually would probably be a little bit too thick for good grain yields. So I think I'd like to see more like 10 to 15, ideally. But even with some of these thinner stands, we had some pretty good yields this year. So the next column is herbicide injury. And so remember, we used Assure and not Broclean. I'm actually going to go back because I don't want to miss say this. Oh, it was Broclean. There you go. So Broclean and Assure. So Assure is a grass herbicide. Broclean is a broadleaf herbicide. We've used Assure in the past with no injury. So it's our belief that all the injury that we experienced came from the broadleaf herbicide, the Broclean. And we chose Broclean because our weed scientist at MSU had done some screening of different herbicides. She used, I don't know, 5 to 10, I think, different products that she tested. And the Broclean was one that actually in her trial looked really good. The injury was quite low when she did that test. So we felt confident we would use that same herbicide and should be in good shape. The thing is, she used Grandi in her trial. And if you look at Grandi here, what can you see? That Grandi only was 0.75 on injury. And of course, when you look across that column there, we had some varieties by Lebreski that were 3.75 out of 5 on herbicide injury. So really, really bad. And the herbicide injury, what we saw was less actually death of plants, but severe stunting. So you kind of ended up with two heights of plants that were injured versus not injured, and that can be a challenge just in terms of evenness for harvest, maturity, and so forth. So some real issues there. And I think it's pretty important information as we start to think about chemical weed control. We do look at flower dates, although in a fiber, sorry, this is a grain. So the flower dates are going to be indication of relative maturity and harvest timing as well. So that's some useful information. And then heights. We see a wide range of heights in the grain material. Some of the grain specific cultivars are quite short. Some of the dual purpose material can be as tall as a fiber crop. So certainly that's going to be important in terms of, are you going to have fiber yield if you're looking for it? Are you going to be dealing with a bunch of fiber that you don't want if that's not your goal, if you're simply focused on grain production? Then this is sort of the yield or outcomes table, if you will, here. So you can see the harvest dates based on maturity. We had a lot of white mold, sclerotinia, in our grain hemp this year. And it's something that we haven't seen much in previous years. It's very highly variable based on field history, based on timing and weather conditions for spore release. And obviously also we have some differences in variety susceptibility to this particular fungal disease. Look at Helicia there versus some of the other varieties that were really devastated by white mold. So pretty interesting there. What we saw in the white mold was premature plant death. And so you ended up with these flowers that had a bunch of immature seed in them. And so certainly, you know, if you're looking to produce grain, that's going to be a real issue. And then we have our grain yields. So we averaged 990 pounds per acre this year. So really nice grain yields at the Hyde location. And you can see some differences there in terms of how they yielded, but overall, a lot of really strong performers this year in terms of grain.
Is this a cleaned amount?
This is clean grain. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Blaine. That's a really good question. So, you know, as you know, if you have experience with grain hemp, you have variable seed maturity, right? Because we're talking about an indeterminate plant. And so you have some mature seed, you have some green seed. And when you measure that yield, whether it's right off the combine, which would have immature seed, mature seed, and to be honest, quite a bit of floral material as well, just because of how that goes at combining time. If you're talking that yield metric versus clean grain yield metric, there can be quite a difference there. So thanks for bringing that up, Blaine. That's a really good point.
And going back to the mold for a minute. So these plots that you put them in, is this the third year of using that same area, that same plot, or are they different plot? Is it different?
Yeah, great question. So we're in general in the same area, but we rotate within this fairly small field that we've got at the Forestry Innovation Center there in Hyde. So the other thing is that the crop that we're rotating with is soybeans, and soybeans are very susceptible to white mold. They're a host for the same exact disease. So that is definitely a factor. Also, we're rotating this small area. We're talking about a fungal disease that's spread by spores, and they can move a little bit of a distance too. And it really doesn't take that many spores, or I should say that many mushrooms that come up, releasing those spores to infect the crop. Also, another really wild observation about the white mold this year. This year we had terrible white mold in the grain hemp. We had almost no white mold in our soybeans. And that's something that really doesn't happen very often. Usually soybeans are quite susceptible, but it gives you a sense of how important timing is, because the primary route of infection for white mold in these crops is through flowers, or if there's an injury to the plant. They really need a kind of route of entry to infect the plant. It really probably was a matter of timing in terms of when those spores were released and when the plants were susceptible, that we saw it in the hemp and not the soybeans this year.
I'll have a question a little bit later, but I don't want to take much of your time on that.
Sure.
Well, real quick, James, is white mold the same as powdery mildew?
It is not. Great question. Those are often confused. Powdery mildew would be a disease that infects the leaf tissue primarily.
Yeah.
We did see some powdery mildew this year in some of our CBD cultivars, but white mold is quite a different thing.
Okay.
White mold, again, is spread by these spores. It infects through the flowers often. And then in the plant are produced these resting bodies. They're called sclerotia. They look like little rat turds, to be honest. They're these little long black things. Those are deposited on the soil when the plant dies, or at harvest time, or if there's tillage. And then they can last in the soil for quite some time. When through tillage, or just naturally when they're in the top 2 inches of the soil, is when they germinate best. And they germinate based upon weather conditions, heat, moisture, humidity, and they produce a little mushroom called the apothecia. And that little mushroom grows out of the soil surface. It's a real tiny little thing, and it releases a lot of spores when the weather conditions are right to infect the plant.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Well, I guess I will bring it up since we talked about this. So I know that a lot of outdoor grows this year for industrial hemp, and also for recreational and medical had a big mold problem. Mm-hmm. So now that you mentioned, is there a correlation, do you think, between that, the like timing of the right humidity, temperature, moisture kind of thing?
It was a funny year. I'll tell you what, I have not seen almost any white mold in our hemp in the previous years, and this year it was all over the place. So I do think it seemed like the weather conditions were right, or maybe we had more susceptible varieties, but we've grown a lot of these varieties in the past. So it was astounding actually how much white mold we had at various locations in our hemp this year. We also had white mold in our CBD. So, there, when the flower is the product you're after, that's a serious issue. We also have botrytis, but we had less botrytis than we had white mold this year. And we also had powdery mildew, but not nearly like the white mold. So it was devastating, really, in many of our varieties this year. You see the CBD and THC there are TBD. So we prioritized analysis for our CBD cultivars that Phil's going to be touching on. And so we don't have that data in here yet, but that is coming soon. Also, if you know anything about grain and fiber in general, they tend to be lower in both of those metrics, and generally compliant, but not always.
Did any of the, now we know from earlier conversations with the state that some fiber varieties went hot. We don't have all the information yet. Do you know if any of these also went hot on you this year?
I don't know on the grain yet, but it's funny you mentioned that. I'm going to touch on the fiber real quickly next, but I'll just jump forward to show you that we did have one fiber variety that went hot. So yes, it was interesting, bringing in some of the new fiber material from Europe this year that we don't have as much experience with. We did have one variety go over. The other scenario where we've seen hot material on the grain and fiber side is some of the folks that are trying to derive multiple products from some of these genetics, where you're looking to maybe harvest grain and biomass for CBD. And in those cases, we also have seen some instances of varieties going over the threshold. So I don't want to step too much more on Phil's toes, but this is our fiber results here. So we only had 5 fiber varieties at our location. There are a few more that came from our friends at Hemp Point that we sent to the other locations. But same information, seeds per pound there in terms of seed size, our stand establishment. Now remember, we planted twice as many. So here we put 50 seeds in the ground and we averaged 20.65 plants, so a little less than half a stand there. The herbicide injury, this was quite interesting. The fiber material from Europe had a lot higher on average herbicide injury than the grain material from Canada. I can only imagine that's because folks are using herbicide for grain production in Canada, and the materials being screened for herbicide tolerance. So if you're growing for fiber, there's no labeled herbicides, but in the future, if there are, be aware that your fiber genetics may be more susceptible to broadleaf herbicides of certain types than some of your grain material. In general, a little bit earlier flowering here and taller heights. And then we also look at the percent male there, because in a fiber system, of course, we're interested in capturing all that, the males and females, and depending on harvest timing, that can be affected by the male to female ratio. And in general, we've seen higher fiber yields from the monoecious varieties that we don't have any of that senescence happening of the males.
So when you went to harvest this fiber varieties, you still had male plants in the field then?
Yes, we did. Yep. We allowed all the varieties to flower. So some were well into flowering and some were just into flowering. But in general, we had retained our males. Yep. Which would really be the goal, I would think, for the fiber system. Then here's our yields. So unredded dry matter yields of 7750 pounds per acre, and redded dry matter yields of 5569. The reason we did that this year is just because I'm curious about the redding process and how much dry matter loss is occurring in the redding process. And you can see that it's some. So that's pretty important to know about. We look at stem diameter as an indication of fiber quality, because the bast to herd ratio is going to be affected by that. And then here we do have the CBD and THC numbers on these particular fiber varieties. So in general, compliant, but close to the threshold in some cases, and one that went over.
Oh, a couple quick questions here, I guess.
Yeah.
I hate to, but how'd you harvest?
So here we harvested by actually sickle bar mowing the entire plot and weighing that whole plot green. And then we take subsamples that we ret and oven dry to get our yields that way.
So this wasn't field retted?
Well, it is field redding in the sense that what we do is we take our subsamples, we bundle those, and then we have left them out for redding outside. Okay. We did ret on turf this year just because it's easy for us to put them out on the lawn and allow that to occur. But we get pretty good redding even in a bundled, a small bundle sample there. I think I'll leave it here to allow Phil to share what he's got. So thanks, everybody. Maybe at the end, we can take questions if there's time.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, appreciate that, James. Thank you very much. And I think for the sake of time, we did have the results of the grain fiber trial in a video format. I will provide the link and have that be available, but just for the sake of time, we might move forward on that just to get going. But all right, everybody, my name is Phillip Alberti. I'm a commercial ag educator with the University of Illinois Extension, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you see everything? Everything looking okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. All right, so everybody, I'm going to talk today about the Midwestern Hemp Database and some other university research updates that are currently going on in the region here. Let me get that out of the way. So again, Phillip Alberti, commercial ag educator with University of Illinois. You can find my contact information available here, or it will be available on the last slide that I have. Please reach out anytime. If you have questions about this, you're looking for resources or about anything I'm talking about today, please do not hesitate to reach out. So for some of you, you may be aware of what the Midwestern Hemp Database is. James briefly talked about this. It's a very large scale research collaborative effort between several land grant institutions, private labs, and importantly, our grower cooperators across the Midwest. Just generally what we did is we were able to provide discounted cannabinoid sampling and testing for our growers throughout the season in exchange for simple data sharing. And what we do is we put all this information into a repository online that is publicly available, that any grower, any processor, anybody can use to hopefully make some informed decisions about variety selection moving forward. So importantly, we have several sources of data going into the database. We have our general grower submissions. Anybody can contribute to that. We have our university research station trials, which James contributes to, which I myself contribute to, and then the Cultivar Check program, which is a new project this year, which I'm going to share the results of for the first time as well today, James. So I get the feeling it's exciting. And then just I wanted to briefly touch over some other research that's being done by other universities because they're doing great work and it needs to be shared. So for those of you who are not aware, this database here is available online at go.illinois.edu/hemp database. And what it allows you to do is pick a source of a genetic, a particular cultivar, perhaps, or cannabinoid of interest. And so, for example, let's just say we look up a very popular variety, Oregon CBD. We select a few of their varieties of which we have information on. And then that data is presented here as both individual data points. So you could see here, for example, this particular sample, it's CBD, THC, CBG, the ratio of those cannabinoids, but also it gives us summary statistics on how those varieties have performed across 2 years in many locations. And so, for example, here you can see for Suver Haze over 2 years, we have 53 samples which were submitted for that particular variety and the data that corresponds to that variety. So it's a great way for you to look up sources of genetics, varieties themselves, cultivars themselves. And also note that these little blue dots here that populate the screen can be clicked on, and it's going to show more information about that particular sample. So some of the information I'm going to talk about is referencing this database as a whole and how we pull in this information. But we've had over 180 grower cooperators over the last 2 years, excuse me. And so we're really excited about the data that we're about to share. So, of course, over 2 years, and I will note that this is more heavily focused on Illinois and Wisconsin than, say, perhaps Michigan, but we've really been able to demonstrate what a typical production season looks like in the Midwest. And granted, you may shift things a little bit, earlier or later, depending on where you are in the Midwest. But for the most part, what we're seeing is an increase in peak transplanting time or into the field in mid to late June. And then we see this kind of peak with flowering practices where varieties begin to flower in mid to late August, in some cases early September, and our harvest period really ramping up in the first and second weeks of October. This just gives you a general idea of the amount of information we've been able to collect over the last few years and how it can be used to help guide production practices. So just a few things that we've gathered over the last few years is that growers are primarily using seed transplants with some clones being used. And a lot of that's being done via transplanting into the field, given that this is a high value crop. Planting into the field is typically around mid-June, but that's going to depend on a few factors that we're going to discuss in a second here. And then irrigation practices are highly variable, but for the most part, growers were not using irrigation on across the larger data set. But what I wanted to point out here is that we finally kind of have some concrete data illustrating photo period and its impact on potential yields. This is some data from North Carolina State, David Suchoff and Maggie Short, who are done some great work over the last few years. And really what they're illustrating is that as we delay planting date into the season, we reduce yields per pound or per plant on a per plant basis for our full season or photo period dependent crops. Why is this important? Well, we have to think about how planting date might interact with, say, something like row spacing, where as we increase the amount of row spacing that we have, we're going to increase the amount of pounds per plant that we can produce. So thinking about how planting date and row spacing and all that is interacting is going to be very important in your overall production system. And just a quick kind of to demonstrate this, while a lot of the information was kind of arbitrary and kind of anecdotal, some work from NC State also showed that, typically between 4 to 5 foot spacing per plant is typically going to produce the greatest net returns. However, I like to always point out to growers to think about what works best for them. In my experience, even using upwards of 6 feet has been for row spacing has been beneficial for me and our growers in our system to really allow us to work with the plant, get in, assess issues, pollination, all that. So just some things to consider. Also, this work was just released last month, actually officially publicized via NC State. Illustrating the impacts of nitrogen on CBD hemp. And what they found is that for an economic optimal rate of about 130 pounds of nitrogen was all that a high CBD hemp crop really needed before it started producing a loss essentially in terms of biomass. So the economic optimal rate was around 130 pounds per acre. So yield was impacted. However, the data over of their variety trials and of their other nitrogen rate trials also show that nitrogen rate did not significantly impact the amount of cannabinoids that are being produced in the plant. So while we may increase yield via fertility, it's not necessarily having an impact on overall cannabinoid development in a very measurable type way. More research is needed on this, of course, but this is the first real good indicator of this on hemp in the US that I'm aware of. So what am I trying to say here? We need to consider how planting date, how row spacing, planting populations, fertility, and importantly, photo period of a specific variety are going to be interacting with one another, right?
Phil, a couple slides back, you need to go back to it, but a couple slides back, it looked like there was a difference between, this one here. So you have white mulch and black mulch here. Is where you also had the difference and show some things?
Yes, I don't want to go into that too much because it wasn't necessarily my study, but you do see an impact perhaps on plastic mulch. This can be due to weed suppression, solarization of the soil. So there's a lot of other factors that I really didn't want to touch too much on. I think the biggest thing, I just didn't want to be, ignorant about it, but I'd say the biggest impact there is how row spacing is going to impact plant development.
Okay.
It's a great question, though. Appreciate it, Blaine.
If anybody has any questions too, while they're watching this, send them in on the chat to us and we'll get them on here. We may go a little longer than 7 o'clock tonight, it looks like. So
I'm going to try to cruise through here. For compliance testing, really too, we're aware of this. We have USDA guidelines, which are illustrated here, showing to take samples from the top 1/3 portion of the plant. But some preliminary work done from the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research, which was cited in the USDA Farm Bill, demonstrates that it's the cannabinoids, especially for THC, are concentrated higher in the top portions of the plant, that apical meristem, and decrease in concentration as you work down the plant. Why is this important? If you're going to be doing sampling, it will behoove you to follow the guidelines because that is the guidelines that the sampling agents are going to follow, and it will ultimately impact the results that you get where you're sampling from on the plant. So make sure you're following the USDA guidelines for that.
Hey, Phil, I'll say one quick thing about that too. I think you can look at that in terms of remediation strategies as well, right? So the far left there, top 1/3 is what you might test in the field for compliance sampling and analysis. But a remediation strategy of a blended biomass product is coming up about, half, right? And I saw some data at the Science of Hemp conference from another researcher that had actually looked at that aggregated biomass, and they were showing reductions of about 1/3 to 1/2 in THC concentration in that aggregated biomass.
That's a great point, James. Absolutely. So, the samples are can be a little misleading in what you have, and especially in terms of options of trying to remediate that or finding ways to use additional biomass to get those concentrations where they need to be. Absolutely. So I want to move into overview of the data from the database. So this is what the data as a whole looks like here, just without using any of the data filters. And really what I want to point out here is how many variety entries we have for distinct varieties. So for example, cherry wine, there's 84 sample submissions. Silver lining, for example, has 50. So we have a lot of data that's been pulled in here over the last few years. So if you're looking to make variety selections, this would be a great place to look for cannabinoid development, CBD to THC ratios, max and mins, things like that. It's all available there. But what I really wanted to say here is that we had over 159 distinct varieties being represented, and there almost 1,400 samples submitted. And I think by the time I actually get through all the data in the next week or so here, we will exceed 1,400 samples. But for now, 1,381. What we found is that over the course of 2 years, 68% of the samples are being submitted through a September through October period of September 8th to October 1st, which is when growers are trying to maximize profitability, which is when flowering is really occurring at the most important rate for a grower. But this can mean that laboratories may be reaching, capacity during these periods. So again, if we think about flowering really happening starting in late August, early September, we start to see samples intake increase dramatically, and that's going to be a concern. So having a good relationship with the laboratory, knowing where and how samples need to be delivered is very important. Also, what I'd like to show over 2 years, we had 402, so 29% of our samples tested above the regulatory threshold for THC. And I remember, James, looking at your presentation, you had a 31% fail rate. So pretty close to what we're seeing over 2 years in the hemp database. And importantly, I'd like to show what has happened here. Previously, the negligence threshold was 0.5% THC. That was increased in the Farm Bill last October to 1%. But you can look here and you can see how many more samples would have failed that negligence threshold previously if it had not been raised to 1%. So pretty important here. So there's a lot of wiggle room in between 5%, 0.5% and 1% in terms of how much CBD can be produced, but it also really gives growers a bit of a blanket here in terms of negligence. But look at this clear-cut relationship. We like to look at relationships as educators, and you can see there's a clear linear relationship between THC and CBD or vice versa. And really what is happening is that as a whole, most of our varieties cannot exceed 0.3%, or are going to exceed 0.3% THC, and they're going to do so at about 8% CBD, 8 to 9% CBD, which comes into, again, it's this relationship, right? And it's a relationship between CBD to THC of about 26 to 1, which is what you end up seeing promoted as kind of a metric for success is CBD to THC. And I'm going to talk more about why that's very important here and how it may be useful to you, but just something to keep in mind over 2 years of data, a very clear relationship. This is seconded from some work shared by Doris Hamilton from Kentucky, who runs the hemp program. You can just see that, over in 2019, 43% of their samples tested above 0.3% THC. So it's a problem everywhere. So for our CBD dominant cultivars, they're exhibiting this nice curvilinear or linear relationship. And typically total CBD, again, is not able to exceed 8% without exceeding 0.3% THC. This CBD to THC ratio of about 20 to 30 to 1 or 25 to 1 will help maintain profitability for growers looking to utilize this value. And it's important to know that all varieties are not created equal and must be compared separately. We put out a report of high potential varieties out last year, and we're going to do that again this year. But this is just some information I wanted to share. So again, this is just demonstrating that clear relationship between CBD and THC, and that for the most part, we're looking at it between about 25 to 1 as a good CBD to THC ratio, or north of that, even 30 to 1 to maximize profitability while maintaining compliance late in the season. So work done from Cornell University supports this as a whole. So I always like to back up what we're doing with our large scale data collection with what's being done by other university research trials to just strengthen what we're trying to do here. And so Cornell showed that most of the varieties in their trials tested between 20 to 1 and 30 to 1. And interestingly enough, didn't really see impacts of CBD to THC ratios, not production of these cannabinoids, but their ratios, not a difference by site. So environment, location, stable genetics, we're typically going to produce the same or similar CBD to THC ratios across environments. The amount of those cannabinoids can change depending on production practices and the environment, but the ratios are fairly stable. So why is that important? Because it means that all the samples collected throughout the database can be kind of aggregated together, and we can feel confident that we're making educated decisions. So when looking at varieties entered into the database, we look at the record count, their CBD to THC average, but also we can look at this ratio here, which gives us an idea. And again, we're looking between 25 and 30 to 1. It's kind of that targeted area, but we've had some entries that have even exceeded that, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Impact on final rules. James talks about the collaboration. This is a truly collaborative effort. We're so proud of the work that we've been able to do together over the last couple of years. And importantly, data from the database was used to impact the USDA final ruling last year, because we were able to submit data as it was coming in from our growers to write a report, which impacted THC testing windows, the negligence threshold, harvest windows, and exemptions for research. So it's pretty important stuff that we're trying to do, and we're going to hope to continue to use this information to impact policy moving forward where applicable. So just a quick thing, I wanted to note that, here in Illinois, we kind of found our own rules. We are technically in kind of a status of limbo. And if you are an Illinois grower, for at least the time being, if you need to get an Illinois license, you'll have to go through the USDA while the current hemp rules are being approved in the review process for approval. So just keep that in mind. All right, so last thing I'm going to talk about is the Cultivar Check program, which was kind of the child of the hemp database. We wrote a grant and we received SARE funding from the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education to do the partnership grant. We took several of the best cultivars or varieties from the 2020 growing season based on select criteria that we liked and that we could agree upon as a collective unit, as a research collective. And then we reached out to the seed companies to provide us with these genetics for us to send to growers free of charge that we could test via the SARE funding. So you'll note that I've had to block out one here due to material transfer agreements. I'm not sure if I can share their data quite yet, but these other ones I can talk about freely. So pretty important to note, we had the varieties. This is the number of locations that they were tested in and the number of sample submissions for each variety in total. So a very large amount of samples we were able to collect across this data set. And it's important to note that at each location for each variety, we tested 3 times, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, and 7 weeks after flowering. And this coincided with university station trials that we were conducting. Importantly, samples were analyzed twice by 2 partnering labs, and then the data on agronomic performance was collected as well. And our goals are really just to create a list of recommended varieties for the region. So here in all these blue sites are where we sent the seeds to. We tried to essentially randomize so the varieties were well represented across the regions, and this is what we came up with. So what we had is at each location, the data was at each location, samples were submitted at 3, 5, and 7 weeks after flowering. And what we saw across our trials as well was that across the aggregate, that across flowering periods as well, that the CBD THC ratios were not impacted. So what we saw in our trial was that, across flowering periods, the CBD to THC ratio was not significantly impacted. And this again supports the research being done by Cornell looking at differences in environmental conditions that have no significant difference in CBD to THC, and again by site. So what we did is we had the samples be sent to one lab, and then they were sent to another. And due to proficiency testing among the labs, we felt that we could take the average across both lab samples because we really wanted to, in the spirit of the hemp database, combine as much information as possible. And we were able to come up with basically this. All right, so we have a variety. We have its expected flowering in the Midwest using the data from our growers. And then we have the number of, the timing when the sample was taken, the number of samples at that time point, and then the total average for those values for CBD, CBG, and THC, as well as the average CBD to THC ratios for those varieties across all time points. So what did we find here? We have a combo chart, and in our blue, or in the histograms here, is the CBD represented on the left. And on the right, represented by these lines here, is our THC. So for example, this green here is the Suver Haze variety for CBD at 3 time points. And this green line represents the THC at those 3 time points. And what did we find? We found that likely most of the varieties that we put into our trial were going to exceed that regulatory threshold of 0.3% THC by week 7, if not before then, in weeks between weeks 5 and 7, at some point in here, really. So this is suggesting that even going 5, 6, 7 weeks is starting to push it for a lot of these varieties, and they need to be tested early and often to ensure compliance.
That's after flowering?
After flowering initiation, correct.
Flowering, okay. Oh yeah, it says right there. Okay, thank you.
So there's very importantly, it was pretty exciting to see the results of this. So again, you can look at how each of these varieties are performing from CBD and THC standpoints. But think about too, is maybe if it's a producer like Suver Haze, which racks up CBD and THC very quickly, that you may be able to harvest it earlier, at an earlier time before it reaches that level when conditions may be more conducive for you. So thinking about production practices, thinking about variety performance, compliance testing, how they all kind of form together into this whole picture of what it means to be a hemp grower.
The conversation today too about disease, the longer that plant's in the field, way more risk for disease, infection and development. So that's really useful.
Absolutely, James. And I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to look across the Cultivar Check program and see what was happening to these THC ratios over time. And you and I have discussed this before too, that maybe even 7 weeks is too late, where we have degradation or dilution of these compounds over time. And that maybe even earlier on, to maximize the effectiveness of the plant, we're looking at an earlier harvest in that week 5, week 6, potentially, maybe even earlier, depending on the variety. But what I thought was very interesting was across many of the varieties as a whole, even into week 7, we started to see a breakdown in this production. So this data was also supported by work done by our University of Illinois replicated trial, and due to NDAs, cannot share the names of some of these varieties yet. But what you're really seeing here is that the CBD to THC ratios are staying in this 20 to 30 range throughout flowering for all of our CBD dominant varieties, or pretty close. This one's a little short, but it's staying in that range. And again, it's throughout flowering and throughout environments. So it's really about stability of the genetics. And then one of the things that I've really found interesting is looking at our CBG dominant cultivars. And I'm going to be wrapping up here in just a moment. What I found very interesting was that not for a single sample across any of the locations or any of the time points did any of our CBG dominant varieties exceed the regulatory threshold for THC. This agreed with the work that we saw from the Midwestern Hemp Database last year, and that may be an opportunity for growers to minimize issues with compliance is by growing a variety that does not produce it in those high amounts. So we can see that both these varieties produced, 9% or north of 9% for CBG, but none of them exceeded the amount of THC for compliant varieties. Pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's good.
So universities out there who are trying to do research and have to convince people to do this work and not have to go with compliant hemp that's going to be non-compliant, I've been pushing them towards CBG dominant varieties because it minimizes the risk a little bit if you're looking to do some easy research type production.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last thing I want to talk about real quick is just day neutral and photoperiod dependent differences in plant growth. Differences in the seeding rate, but I wanted to use some information from James's trials that he published last year that's available currently online to just demonstrate to you that strip biomass for photoperiod dependent versus day neutral type varieties is going to be tremendously different, and how that factors into your production system. Seeding rates are going to be much different, and just when you're harvesting, but also keep in mind, the hemp database is useful for cannabinoid development, but when you're looking at variety performance for a region, look to your university station trials. For yield, look to them to get a more accurate representation of what's going to happen in your field. So we can look at performance and yield metrics with our variety trials and then use the hemp database for cannabinoid development, merge the two together and come up with an educated guess on what the best varieties are going to be for you. Again, this is work that James has illustrated. This is work from Shelby Ellison from UW-Madison, also published and available online, showing differences in flowering initiation and flowering across a particular variety. So again, we're combining yield, we're combining flowering dates and flowering ranges, looking for varieties that have tighter flowering windows to minimize issues with compliance potentially and harvest down the line, combining all this data from all of the work that we're doing together to try to make a good guess on which you're going to grow. So I really want to point out that this is, we have our grain fiber trials from the University of Illinois, and those are available here. We have 2 years of data, 2020 and 2021, and we had 30 varieties in our grain fiber trial this last year. And we also have a great YouTube video available showing the whole trial from start to finish, and that is also available here. You can use either the QR codes or just use the links below, and that'll get you there. And the last thing I'm going to say is this has truly been a collaborative effort between all of us, from the Midwestern Hemp Database and the Midwestern Hemp Collaborative to our growers, to our private sponsors, for SARE for funding this project. And I get a kick out of it when I think that James and I still haven't met, and that we started this thing over Zoom when the pandemic started, and our group of collaborators has still been meeting regularly, and this is just how we're doing things now. So hopefully one day I'll get to shake your hand, James, but for the time being, it's been great to work with you on these projects, and I look forward to continuing and doing that. So with that, I will take any questions that you have.
Well, Phil, we'll make that happen in May. How does that sound?
Oh, looks great.
You come to the Expo and that'll happen. So
I'll be there.
Dave, have we got any questions that have come in online from anything?
No, but I can, if anyone, we have some attendees on Zoom, so if anyone wants to raise their hand, they can, or Alice, or we have Alice, Dennisine, Marlon, we can promote them, bring them in. But I wanted to ask, how can we help you with this?
We need growers. We're going to need some more growers this year for our trials who want to participate on either the discounted testing or growing some cultivars for us. We send you the varieties, we pay for the shipping, we pay for the testing. All you have to do is just follow the rules for compliance. And if they get too hot, they got to be destroyed. But it's a little science experiment that you get to do. And in some cases, what our growers are even trying to do is ones that they grew for us this year that they liked a lot, they're going to grow again for production this year. Because they had that experience with it. They feel confident with it and they know what it's going to do. So we need growers. We want people who are looking to participate. And it's super easy to do. We just got to make sure you're a licensed grower with some experience, have a conversation with us, and we get you set up.
So what's the smallest plot that would fit, in your, to participate in your study?
That most of that's going to come down to the requirement by the state, tribe, or the federal government, basically depending on what you are you have to do. So for example, last year in Wisconsin, they needed a set number of plants per variety. So we basically send you 25 to 30 seeds of that variety, hoping that we get at least 15 plants per variety that we can take data from, sample from. So we don't want this to be a burden. Growers can take more, but we keep it smaller and controlled so we can be a little bit more accurate with how we're collecting that data.
Is there a way, so right now, the state of Michigan, it costs $1,350 to have a grower license. So if someone wanted to grow, maybe 25, 30 plants just for a trial, that's a pretty big burden to take on. Is there a way to get any kind of research license or get a license under another organization?
So at least, from my experience, not quite yet, really. It's really that even here in the state, at this point now, for us growers in Illinois, we have to get a production license to do research currently because of how our regulations stand. So it comes down to each state and how they do things and if they're following federal guidance. But for the most part, I would say pretty much no. You are going to have to be this will be for growers who are already looking to grow themselves, and this will just be a supplemental thing to do.
Yeah, well, it's
unfortunate. We've had discussions about the importance of research, and I know that those are things that are being discussed and hopefully addressed by projects like this, by getting people to be involved with it, growers to be a part of it, and to show that how we can do this work. Hopefully, we'll have some say in that moving forward.
The economic incentive we do offer is a reduced price for analysis. You still have to go through your state or tribe, et cetera, for compliance testing. But if you're doing, other pre-harvest sampling to time harvest, things like that, we can help you achieve that at a lower cost by participating in the database. So that's kind of the carrot that we offer aside from the data itself.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, James. I didn't mention that the discounted cannabinoid testing came in at $35. All of our partnering labs agreed to that rate, which is half, if not more than half, of some of other places that are charging for that. Yeah.
And Rachel Berry says hi to you guys.
Hey, Rachel.
She reached out on Facebook. So, man, this is great. This is, Blaine and I have talked over and over since we met in 2018 that we're going to be smarter next year. And this is the kind of stuff that it takes to get there, right? We need more of this.
Wow. One thing I'm just making a general observation here about all the data, because there's a lot of data to absorb.
Yeah, we have to come through it.
And I think we're going to need to repeat this show at some point with you guys, probably before the expo. But it looked like if we could go to this 0.1%, right, instead of the 0.3, looks like 1%, excuse me, thank you, that it would eliminate most of this problem with people having to worry about things going high, and having to destroy the crop. I mean, your data, it shows it. It's just amazing. Absolutely amazing. Wow.
I'd take 0.5%, to be honest, with you, Blaine. I mean, just the jump, you're literally able to double your CBD production by almost increasing it from 0.3 to 0.5. Your CBD production would increase dramatically. And then, you'd have reduced risk because most of those varieties would be out of the field before they reach that level. So 1% would be a dream, but I'd take 0.5 gladly.
Because you're always dealing with that ratio, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say here, what did we pull for that for 0.5? What did I say? 7% of the tests that came through, 6.5%. So only 7% exceeded 0.5% THC. 93% pass rate's pretty good. So, yeah. And
Wow.
we're gonna keep doing this. We've had discussions with the USDA to send this stuff off. They know where to find it, and we're just hoping that we can keep this relationship going of growers submitted data, research coming in, and science informing policy. It's all we can really hope for.
As far as sponsoring what you guys doing, are you offering some type of sponsoring opportunities? Do you guys need money?
I mean, we take it.
Everybody needs money, so I just want to put it out there since we have an audience, perhaps. So,
all seriousness, absolutely. I mean, and I see the biggest opportunities there is again partnering with growers. I mean, and doing it that way. That's the way I like doing it for this project. Supplemental testing. I mean, the SARE funding itself, for example, it covered some of the testing we did for our university trial, just for some random grower submissions. We said, hey, can we get some extra samples submitted? We have data we'd like to provide, but we would like to do some additional testing through the project. Some of our partners, we're trying to help growers out as best we can. And that's really where I see the funding availability being able to go. So sponsoring a grower who wants to do a trial or sponsoring a site or a location, let us know. We're definitely interested in stuff like that.
Excellent.
So we did have one thing that came in the chat here. It said, if you bump the percentage, then wooden seed companies also just push the limits again. So
I'll respond to that, Blaine. I think just personal opinion here, it would be much more rational to regulate consumer products than regulate the plant in the field prior to harvest. So I agree. I mean, I think to me, the basic premise of the way that the regulation has been designed, sampling the crop pre-harvest in the field is problematic to begin with. And so, I think, there's a lot that we could do to make life easier for hemp producers. And I think that regulating the consumer product would be the best one. I mean, that's how we treat other crops, right? When I grow wheat, if it has mycotoxins that can make people sick, the government isn't coming out and sampling that crop in my field. I take it to the elevator after harvest. They test it there. If it has high levels of mycotoxins, they pay me a little bit less for it. And then they blend it with clean grain to achieve the regulatory standard for mycotoxins in wheat or whatever that grain is. That is the strategy that we use in most other agricultural products. And to me, regulating the processing and the consumer product going out the door would be the rational approach. But I'll get off my soapbox.
And once we process it and put it into an oil or distillate, you're out of regulation already.
Yes.
You're sunk, in reality, as soon as you process it. So there's no way you're going to condense everything and be under 0.3% THC. So yeah, it's that final product. So that's where that whole thinking has to change.
Well, guys, this has been really just a great show, and man, just so much information to try to absorb. We're looking forward to being able to see this stuff online. And thank you again for all the hard work you guys are doing, because this is what we need. We need this information out there, and we really appreciate it. And I can see right now that your sessions in May are going to have to be more than an hour to be able to get all the information out. So we're going to stretch you guys out a little bit there when we get to that point for doing that. So so everybody remember in May, you can come meet these guys in person and be able to get a lot of information there and we'll have it there. And now you can start using some of this stuff for your decisions as you go forward for this year. So, utilize it. That's what it's there for. That's what they're doing all the hard work for. So,
I'm just thinking all these studies, maybe we should link to them from the iHemp website.
Yes, sir.
So that people can easily find them. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes, and we can certainly I'll create a post, and on the homepage you'll find it with links to it.
So anything for before we close up here? I got the recipe, and I can do that real quick. But anything else you want to touch on before we get into that? Last comments?
Thank you for the opportunity to share the work. It's always great to do that.
It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. iHemp has always been a leader in our state and an excellent collaborator as a researcher. My head is in the dirt most days. We're focused on the work in the field. We need folks like iHemp that are telling the story, that are supporting the industry and getting the word out about our research. So thank you all for having us.
And we're glad to do it. And now let's talk about food.
Yeah, we can talk about food. Before we do that, a couple of things. I want to do two quick things. One is next week's show. We're going to be doing with Heartland Industries. Heartland Industries is moving ahead tremendously in the state here. Right now, they are planning between 3,500 and 5,000 acres of fiber that they're doing this next year, kind of down in the southwest part of the state. But what they do there will now allow us and will move forward the hemp industry for everybody with the fiber. So we're really excited to have them on next week, and they can talk about their project and where that's going. They got a little grant money to do some research as well. So we're really looking forward to that. So we've told everybody, everybody's from the beginning has said grain and fiber is where it's going to move to eventually. And we're in a big way. That's going to happen this year in the state of Michigan. So we're excited to have them on next week. Also,
can I throw in a quick plug, Blaine, for my show next week?
Yeah.
We're going to have Andrew Brisboe on for the full hour. Andrew Brisboe, of course, is the executive director of the Michigan Marijuana Regulatory Agency. He's going to be using my show at Wednesday at 4 o'clock on Facebook. 1 o'clock on Facebook. Got too many fours in my head. To disclose what the 2021 adult use and medical total sales are for 2021. It's going to be somewhere in the vicinity of $2 billion, give or take. We just don't know the final number yet. So, but he's going to share that with my audience next week. So,
well, we might want to make sure, Dave, that we put a little plug in for that earlier in the week, so everybody can look in on his show for sure. So, absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
You're welcome.
You're doing a lot of great work on that side. We know you are. So,
thank you.
And then I want to talk once again about the Expo. It's going to be in May, 21st, 22nd in Lansing. Going to be a great time. A lot of great information is going to be shared there. Don't miss this opportunity when we have that. Friday night will be the big party night. So we're looking forward to that for sure. So with all that being said, we are going to talk about food, a wonderful food recipe here. Since it is winter, now on my side of the state, we've been having winter warnings, winter watchings, and there's a lot of snow here. So great time to talk about this. Is a winter squash with hemp nut filling is what this is.
Hey, Blaine,
Yeah,
this is what I needed to get with you with. This is from Hemp Fabric. I have to get it in yeah, I have to put the hemperer on it yet for you.
okay.
I wanted to let you know you have a new
Oh,
hemperer
thank you.
coming.
I actually was smart enough to bring the hat with me, but it's out in the car, not here today. So
Well, you need your hemperer hat. Come on.
I do, but at least we got a recipe today. So
Yeah, there we go. When
yeah.
is it the winter squash with hemp nut filling?
Yeah,
There
yeah.
we go.
It is extra. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So extra virgin olive oil, 1 small yellow onion, 2 cloves of fresh garlic, Granny Smith apple, peeled, cooked, and diced, a stalk of celery, zest of lemon, golden raisins, half a cup of shelled hemp seeds, 1 tablespoon of hemp seed oil, 2 to 3 sprigs fresh parsley minced, and 2 winter squash halved and seeded. Good choice are acorn, butternut, or I can't even say the word. Hokey, I'm going to call it hokey dokey, but that's, oh, how do you say it?
Pumpkin.
Okay, well, pumpkin, all right, works for me too. I know, and hokey dokey pumpkin, how's that sound?
Yeah.
It's pretty simple. You preheat the oven to 350, you put small amount of olive oil in the skillet, and I always say to replace that with the hemp, but not on this one, because they're saying, with the skillet, hemp oil has a lower flash point, so I would stick with the olive oil on this one, folks, where they talk about it in here. Of course, there's another place where the hemp oil goes, but in the skillet, use the olive oil. You add the onion, the garlic, and spread over medium heat. Bring it to a sizzle, add a pinch of salt. You stir in the apples, the celery, the lemon zest, and season lightly with salt. You saute it for 2 to 3 minutes. Remove from the heat and stir in the raisins, hemp seed oil, and parsley. And you arrange the squash in a baking dish, and you spoon in the mixture evenly into the cavities in the squash, and pour about a ½ inch of water in the dish to keep that all nice and moist while you're cooking it. Cover tightly with foil and bake for 40 minutes. And then away we go. So enjoy the scrumptious, sweet winter squash baked to perfection and deliciously balanced with the rich, nutty flavor of hemp seed. I can't think of a more wonderful special occasion side dish. And we always want to give credit where credit is due. This is out of the Hemp Nut Cookbook. It's Richard Rose and Bridget Mars is where you got that from. So
Excellent.
all right. So
Very
thanks
good.
everybody. I know we went a little long tonight, but whoa, what a lot of information.
All right. Thanks so much, James. Thanks, Philip.
Thanks, guys.
Always
Take
good to
care,
see you,
everybody.
Mike.
All right, you too.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
next week.
All right, see you next week. And don't forget to tune into Mike's show on Wednesday at 1
1:00.
o'clock.
Be live. Andrew Brisboe. Actually, I'm encouraging people to send in questions in advance. Mike at mimarijuanareport.com, and we'll fire him off at Andrew. We got him for the whole hour,
right.
and see what he comes up with.
That should be fun.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.